Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for November 2017. Ernest Hemingway. We're going to take a look at Ernest Hemingway, his life before the war, during the war, and after the war, and how it connected to Michigan. So sit back and relax and enjoy Ernest Hemingway. The State Report. Major General Gregory Vadnais, head of the Department of Veterans and Military Affairs, called Michigan's WW1 Centennial Commission to its first meeting on December 15th. Just a reminder to check the latest events for Michigan's WW1 Centennial. Please go to ww1cc.org/Michigan. One century ago, November 1917. On November 3, 1917, French troops arrived in Italy to help the Italian army. On November 4, 1917, British troops also arrived in Italy to help the Italian army. On November 6, 1917, Passchendaele was captured by the Canadian forces. Also, in Mesopotamia, Tikrit is captured by British forces. On November 7, 1917, General Cardona is relieved of command. General Diaz is now commander of the Italian army. November 8, 1917, the Bolshevik coup d'etat in Petrograd had Lenin assume premiership and Trotsky become foreign minister, replacing the Kerensky government. On November 15, 1917, Alexander Kerensky flees Petrograd after Lenin and Trotsky take over. On November 15, 1917, Alexander Kerensky flees Petrograd. On November 16, 1917, George Clemenceau is appointed French premier and also war minister. November 25, 1917, German forces under Colonel von Lettow-Volbach defeat Portuguese forces at Gomano and start operations in Portuguese East Africa. On November 27, 1917, the Entente governments formed the Supreme War Council, which was an allied administrative organization to coordinate their military actions. Its most significant achievement was to establish control over Allied shipping to supply and transport food and raw materials from around the world. November 27, 1917, was the first meeting of the Russian and German delegates behind German lines to arrange for an armistice between Germany and Russia. November 29, 1917, the first meeting of the Inter-Allied Conference in Paris was held. Over 15 nations were represented. It's a permanent body that will deal with military operations on the Western Front. Ernest Hemingway was an American novelist, short story writer, and journalist. His understated style had a strong influence on 20th century fiction, while his life of adventure and public image influenced later generations. Hemingway produced most of his work between the 1920s and the 1950s and won a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. He published 7 novels, 6 short story collections, and 2 nonfiction works. Additional works included 3 novels, 4 short story collections, and 3 nonfiction works which were published posthumously. Many of his works are considered classics in American literature. Ernest Hemingway was the second child and first son born to Clarence and Grace Hemingway on July 21, 1899, in Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. His father was a physician and his mother was a musician. Both were well educated and well respected in the Oak Park community. Hemingway's mother frequently performed in concerts around Oak Park. As an adult, Hemingway professed to hate his mother. Her insistence that he learn to play the cello became a source of conflict. but later he admitted the music lessons were useful to his writing. During the summer months, they spent them at Windermere on Walloon Lake near Petoskey, Michigan. Hemingway's father taught him how to hunt, fish, and camp in the woods and lakes in northern Michigan. As a young boy, early experiences in nature that instilled a passion for the outdoor adventure and living in remote or isolated areas. After leaving high school, Ernest went to work for the Kansas City Star as a cub reporter. Although he stayed there only 6 months, he relied on the Star's style guide as a foundation for his writing, such as use short sentences, use short first paragraphs, use vigorous English, be positive, not negative. During his stay in Kansas City, Ernest joined the Missouri Home Guard. This was because his vision was so bad the Army would never accept him. This way he gained some military experience. And in early 1918, he responded to the Red Cross recruitment effort in Kansas City and signed on to become an ambulance driver in Italy. He left New York in May and arrived in Paris as the city was under bombardment from German long-range artillery. By June, he was at the Italian front. During his time at the Italian front, he first met his longtime friend, John Dos Passos, who he had a rocky relationship for decades. On his first day in Milan, Italy, he was sent to the scene of a munitions factory explosion, where rescuers had to retrieve the shredded remains of the female workers. He described the incident in his nonfiction book, Death in the Afternoon. On July 8, 1918, he was seriously wounded by mortar fire, having just returned from the canteen bringing chocolate and cigarettes for the men at the front. Despite his wounds, Hemingway assisted soldiers to safety, for which he received the Italian Silver Medal for bravery. Still only 18, Hemingway said of the incident, "When you go to war as a boy, you have a great illusion of immortality. Other people get killed, not you. Then when you are badly wounded the first time, you lose that illusion. And you know it can happen to you." He sustained several shrapnel wounds to both legs, underwent an immediate operation at the distribution center, and spent 5 days in a field hospital before being transferred for recuperation at the Red Cross Hospital in Milan. He spent 6 months at the hospital, where he met and formed strong friendships with Chink Dorman Smith that lasted for decades, and shared a room with future American Foreign Service officer, ambassador, and author Henry Serrano Villard. While recuperating from his wounds in Italy, he fell in love for the first time with Agnes von Korowski, a Red Cross nurse 7 years his senior. By the time of his release and return to the United States in January of 1919, Agnes and Ernest had decided to marry within a few months in America. However, in March, she wrote that she had become engaged to an Italian officer and broke off the relationship. Ernest was devastated by Agnes's rejection, and in future relationships he followed a pattern of abandoning a wife before she abandoned him. In January of 1919, Ernest returned home to Oak Park. Not yet 20 years old, he had gained from the war maturity that was at odds with living at home without a job and with the need for recuperation. Ernest could not really tell his parents what he had thought when he saw his bloody knee. He could not say how scared he was in another country with surgeons who could not tell him in English if his leg was coming off or not. In September of 1919, he took a fishing and camping trip with high school friends to the back country of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The trip became the inspiration for his short story, Big Two-Hearted River, in which a semi-autobiographical character, Nick Adams, takes to the country to find solitude after returning from the war. Before Ernest Hemingway became obsessed with bullfighting, big game hunting, deep sea fishing, Michigan's Little Traverse Bay region inspired his imagination. In the woods beyond the family cottage and the opulent resort hotels, he eyed the wildlife, gun in hand and a cast in his line, in a clear streams and rivers, often making friends with the Algonquin-speaking Ottawa and Ojibwe who lived in the shadow of a lumbering era past. Hemingway once told his brother that he had written a number of stories about Michigan country, and that country was always true, but what happens in the stories was fiction. Creatively driven by the principle that what is left out of the story is equally as important as what is included, Hemingway's Michigan-inspired works are inventive stories which, just beyond their surface, reveal familiar faces, names, trails, hills, lakes, and streams. In 1898, Dr. Clarence Hemingway and his wife, Gracie Hall, purchased 4 lots on the shore of Walloon Lake. In 1900, the couple spent $400 to have a cottage constructed on the site, which they dubbed Windermere. The family spent summers at the cottage. Ernest was born in 1899 and spent every summer from 1900 to 1920 there except 1918. In 1904, they added a kitchen to the main house with a breezeway. Later, a small annex was constructed to provide more bedrooms. In 1921, Hemingway and Hadley Richardson honeymooned in the cottage. Hemingway returned to the cottage only once more in his life in the early 1950s.
And no, he's not always nice, and he can be a real SOB, okay, in real life. And he can turn you and stab you in the back and forget about it. Another great storyteller who would be his nemesis in the late 1920s and 30s also fabricated his service. And Hemingway's got a great short story called Soldier's Home in 1924. It's a great story, but it's one of those where Harold Krebs lies. He had to learn to lie to survive. Went into under the military and hated it, and then E. Cummings ended up getting in prison because he wrote letters home disparaging the Army, and that's where Enormous Room comes, that book of E. Cummings wrote. So a lot of guys weren't comfortable with the U.S. Army service. Tubman didn't want to go back and serve in France. So he said, how about Italy? It's pretty open, not many guys there yet, let's go, and they did. So they signed up for Red Cross served. Like his grandfather's, he saw, the battlefront at one point. He will even see more of a war than his grandfathers did. So he's itching to get there, and he thought about grandfather's service and that when he was there. And his grandfather's still alive. Anson didn't die till 1928. And so he's thinking about the military and his family. And they cleaned up that mess, and then they were sent near the Italian front, and they were near the Piave River. And there's a picture of him driving an ambulance. He's sitting in the ambulance driver's seat, but there's no evidence he really drove. He was only at the front for about 3 weeks until he gets wounded. Most of the time, he was more at the station than he was in driving. Most of us think that the picture was kind of he might have drove once or twice, but he was not an ambulance driver, okay? So most of the time, he even had downtime, like you have in any army, and they were bored, and they played cards, and hung out with the Italians, and drank grappa, learned to drink grappa, and learned to drink better wine, and so he had to, he was up in the mountains, he had a pretty good, but the point is, he got itchy for the front one to see the explosions close up, and he got his chance when, in July, he wanted to go there, and he volunteered for they called it a rolling canteen books, but they argue about it. It was a little semi-permanent canteen set up near the front by the Piave River near the town of Salta. So he was there, and on a bike, this was his own, volunteerism. No one made him do it. So you can't say Hemingway's ever yellow. It's just that he tells the story coming up his own way about his service. But so he delivered chocolates and cigarettes and stuff like that. And the Red Cross got a lot of cigarettes, and the Italians didn't have a lot of those kind of amenities. So when you gave those guys cigarettes, right, when they're hiding behind walls and firing and stuff, they really appreciated it. So he did. He went up at the front, and July 8th, he was there during a bombardment when a trench mortar shell came up in the air, and he described it as a chug chug. He heard it coming through the air, and then it exploded. And he said, I like if it actually happened this way, but I like the way he described it as like a big furnace door of the shrapnel got into his legs. He claims it'll be 227 pieces. Well, how would you ever know? Because he's probably working those out the rest of his life, like a lot of vets did. But the thing so he's on the ground, and we reality check if this was being filmed. He's probably on the ground, and he stayed on the ground. You know, when you even get that much in your legs, you're not running anywhere. You're not carrying anybody on your back, as he said later. Remember how the story was? He got a guy carried a fireman style, and he fell, and that never happened. You know, didn't mean to happen. The Italians are going to give him an award of merit anyway. But and so this is the story that more or less happened, but the one he tells, and then he's in Milan Hospital for many months, and he's going to meet Agnes von Karowski, the American nurse that's just her father emigrated here from Poland. While he's there, he meets her. Okay, well, he comes home that fall. He comes back home to Oak Park. He comes back home with his officer's uniform that he's half here, but he has his field uniform too, and he's got the bloody pants that are kind of shredded up, and he carries those around with him, and he collected German. There's a great picture of him with Austrian helmets, I should say, and a bunch of stuff. They collected pistols, and they're all like probably been drinking, and that was it. So he brought home a pistol, and and all this stuff. And he learned to drink on some different liqueurs, and he brought those home and hid them underneath his bed. See, Mom and Dad didn't drink. They're also they're abstemious. Christians and that. So when he's coming home, he's already been everywhere. Then again, he'd already kind of fallen in love. He's already been drinking. He's already saw death. He's not the same guy. So he comes home kind of playing both sides of the game. One that people argue he wasn't shell shocked. He was wounded and he had to get over it. He started sleeping in a lot, too many air servicemen. But as we know, we didn't have that many regular troops there. So this reporter saw this guy hobbling off with the crutches that was kind of with a cape on, and he gave him this big talk about how his version of the service starts nationwide. And he gives this reporter this great thing of, I was there, and I fought with the, excuse my Italian again, if anybody can say Arditi, Arditti, the mountain troops, the guys with the trench knives, the tough guys. He admired those guys. He met some of them. But he said he served with them. That's how he got wounded. No. Well, the thing is, he didn't want to come home and say, I was in the Red Cross. I served. Now, what we would say, Dennis, is there's not that many guys in the Army, in the military say, where were you with them? What mountain, and it wasn't like he couldn't have done it. It was the orgone or the music. He would have been challenged in a minute. But it was in Italy, we didn't have any ground troops there, so it'd be like, he could lie a lot, And the he said, we're so tough, I fought with them. When they get a bullet hole, they'd stick a cigarette butt in there and keep fighting, And I mean, they may have, I don't know, but this is the way. So when he went to go talk at Hope Park High School, he went back to his high school, all these ladies' events, even up in Petoskey, he'd hold up those ripped up pants with the blood on them, get the boys, soldiers on the periphery. Never a GI like, Norman Mailer's, comes out with, Naked and Dead. It's just the drunk guys in the landing crafts and in the boats. His guys are like guerrilla fighter in hills with Italian anarchists serving in Spanish Civil War with, gypsy and other elements in the mountains. They're like renegades. He always loved to study renegades. In fact, he mentions them often, like Mosby's Raiders. I don't know why. And Sun Also Rises, I think he talks about Mosby, and he always liked these irregulars, kind of like maybe Grandpa chasing Quantrill. I don't know what it is. He writes about war often from in his fiction very differently. Men at War came out in 1944, so he got this book deal to put together what he thought were the best writings in the history that he could get rights to. So, getting back to the Civil War, the only book in its entirety in there. Of course, they wouldn't be because War and Peace is Tolstoy's absurded. That's about as big as that. It was Stephen Crane's Right Back to Courage. And see, that was another thing, Civil War, that's remained one of his favorite American books. He would reread. You could see that war's going to stay in as a center part of his life. I know lesser part of World War II, that's a whole other story. But the Spanish Civil War, still in his consciousness. My friends read a lot of letters and talked with a lot of survivors of Lincoln brigades, and Hemingway would often compare the American Civil War with their Civil War. Republic, their republic fighting, and our republic fighting for republic. It might have been apples and pears, but he could speak that to the guys. So they had he said the Lincoln Brigade and blah blah blah. A friend of his was from Pennsylvania, and he talked about Gettysburg, while they were fighting and that. So Civil War never was going to go away. It never will. I don't think it is with me, because I grew up with it so much in the house and going to the battlefields. It kind of stays with you if it's part of your upbringing. And I didn't think Franco and his coalition, they weren't all fascists. Flange were. That's another complicated war, and he was in the middle of it, but he came out of that one not wanting to be involved with war for a while, but World War II is going to come, and we know his service in France. He did not liberate Paris, by the way. He had an interesting life, even if you don't like his writing, and and you have problems with his views on certain things, but he was pretty much an apolitical guy with a very vindictive personality. He didn't keep friends long, but he was in his prime. He was a very talented. We can't argue that, and he did influence a lot of people. So.
Little girl, don't cry, I must say goodbye. Don't you hear the bugle call? And the pipe and drum beat the fellows come where the flag waves over all. Though I love you so, it is time to go, and a soldier in me you'll find. When on land or sea they need boys like me, you would not have me stay behind. So send me away with a smile, little girl. Brush the tears from eyes of brown. It's all for the best, and I'm off with the rest of the boys from my own hometown. It may be forever we part, little girl, and it may be for only a while. But if I fear we must, then on God is our trust. So send me away with a smile. When I leave you, dear, give me words of cheer to recall in a time